at 1. This is Eamon Lawler. Good afternoon. The headlines. The Supreme Court has ruled against RTE over its ban on interviews with members of Sinn Féin.
RTE has lost its Supreme Court appeal on Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act. RTE was appealing against a High Court ruling that the station was wrong to ban interviews with members of Sinn Féin solely because they were members of that party. Our legal affairs correspondent, Kieran Wood.
During the Gateaux bakery strike in 1990, RTE recorded 6 interviews with the chairman of the strike committee, Larry O'Toole. But when RTE discovered that Mr O'Toole was a member of Sinn Féin, they refused to broadcast any further interviews with him. RTE claimed the only way to comply with Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act was to ban all interviews with members of Sinn Féin. In the High Court last year, Mr Justice O'Hanlon ruled that RTE was wrong to extend Section 31 to all members of Sinn Féin, even when they weren't talking about political issues. Following that judgment, RTE issued a direction to staff to stick to the existing guidelines pending a Supreme Court appeal. Mr O'Toole again appealed to the High Court, which ordered RTE last December to issue new guidelines to staff in accordance with the earlier ruling. RTE appealed against both those rulings, and today the Supreme Court dismissed the appeal. The Chief Justice said RTE was entitled to take reasonable and practical steps to comply with Section 31. That could involve barring members of Sinn Féin from taking part in live broadcasts. But Mr Justice Finlay said RTE could supervise and monitor recorded interviews with members of Sinn Féin to ensure they didn't contravene Section 31. He said RTE had misinterpreted the Act. Mr John Traynor, counsel for RTE, said the station would instruct staff to apply Section 31 in accordance with the court ruling, and it wasn't necessary to order the station to issue a new directive to staff. Kieran Wood, RTE News, the Supreme Court.
In a statement issued after the judgment, Larry O'Toole said the decision was a victory for free speech for trade unionists and other groups. He called the judgment a crushing blow to RTE's reputation for fairness and objectivity.
Thanks, Michael. Later in the news at 1, after the Supreme Court's ruling against RTE's interpretation of Section 31, we'll have an interview with the man with whom interviews on a trade union matter were not broadcast in 1990. We'll also be talking to the author of the 1976 legislation, Dr. Conor Cruise O'Brien. You're listening to the news at 1. As you heard, the Supreme Court has ruled against RTE's ban on interviews with members of Sinn Féin. The court was ruling on RTE's appeal in the case of Lawrence O'Toole. A Sinn Féin member at the station decided not to broadcast interviews with him in 1990 when he was chairman of a strike committee at Gateaux Limited. The Supreme Court upheld the High Court's ruling that to exclude interviews with Mr O'Toole in his capacity as a union officer was not a correct interpretation of Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act. Our legal affairs correspondent Kieran Wood joins me now from the centre of Dublin. Good afternoon, Kieran.
Good afternoon, Eamon. Yes, hello.
Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you, yes.
Yes, did the court deal exclusively? We heard how the court dealt with RTE's arguments as to the practical possibilities of imposing a partial ban on Sinn Féin members. Was that the essence of the court ruling?
No, that was the essence of the RTE argument. RTE said that the purpose of Section 31 was to prevent RTE being used to subvert the authority of the state, and they said that because of the number of people in RTE doing interviews, there are nearly 2,000 people working for RTE, and because of their varying interpretations of Section 31, the only safe way to comply with the Act was to ban all interviews with members of Sinn Féin, no matter what they were talking about, whether it was gardening or whatever it might be. Mr O'Toole had said that this blanket ban was an extension of the ministerial order, and if the minister had intended to ban all members of Sinn Féin, he would have said so. And in fact, the Chief Justice accepted that RTE was entitled to take what he called reasonable and practical steps to comply with Section 31, but he said the O'Toole interview clearly didn't come into that forbidden category. He said if Mr O'Toole had tried to canvass support for Sinn Féin during the interviews during the Gateaux strike, that would have been different. But Mr O'Toole wasn't doing that, and Mr Justice Finlay accepted that RTE had exceeded Section 31. RTE, unfortunately, pleaded something of a two-edged sword. In the Supreme Court, RTE pleaded Section 18 of the 1960 Broadcasting Act, which says that all news broadcasts should be objective and impartial, and that RTE shouldn't broadcast anything likely to incite to violence or crime or to undermine the authority of the state. Well, RTE said said that there was an obvious link between Sinn Féin and the IRA, and that the IRA were pledged to overthrow the state, and on that basis they shouldn't broadcast interviews which could lead to subversion of the authority of the state. But in fact, the Chief Justice said, well, if Section 18 required objective and impartial news broadcasts, then obviously RTE had to monitor and supervise those broadcasts, and if they could do it for other matters, they could do it for Section 31 as well. And so if they were interviewing somebody who was a member of Sinn Féin and doing a recorded interview, they could supervise and monitor the interview and make sure it didn't contravene Section 31, and then they could broadcast it.
And that matter of recording the interviews and listening back to them, editing them if necessary, is the court's answer to the practical problem raised by RTE?
Yes, and also the court said that if, for example, somebody from Sinn Féin was to come in, for example, to a discussion programme and looked as if they might start talking about Sinn Féin politics, they could be barred from that programme. The court said that that wasn't an unreasonable way of making sure that RTE complied with Section 31. The other issue which was brought up was the issue of Mr. Justice O'Hanlon's order in December last year. What he said to RTE at the time was that RTE was wrong to issue this directive to staff to say comply with the existing directives until the Supreme Court appeal. Mr. Justice O'Hanlon said RTE had no right to do that when the High Court had already given a direction on this matter, and he said RTE were to issue a new order. Well, now today in the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice said that RTE weren't sure whether or not the court was in a position to direct RTE to issue these guidelines to staff, and he asked RTE what their view was on that. And Mr. John Traynor, who's counsel for RTE, said that RTE would instruct staff to apply Section 31 in accordance with today's ruling, and it wasn't necessary for the court to order RTE to issue a new directive to staff.
Kieran, thank you for that. On the phone now is Conor Cruise O'Brien, who, as Minister for Posts and Telegraphs, introduced the Broadcasting Amendment Act of 1976, under the provisions of which a ministerial order prevented RTE from broadcasting interviews or reports of interviews with a spokesperson for Sinn Féin. Dr. Cruise O'Brien, good afternoon.
Yes, good afternoon.
I take it you are pleased with this ruling?
Yes, I am. The rulings both of the High Court and of the Supreme Court are in accordance with the actual wording of the Act, which is quite clear. It refers to spokesmen, we said spokesmen in those days, and not to members. That is in accordance with the intention of the framers of the legislation now in force, of whom I am one. As you say, I introduced the measure in the Oireachtas.
But surely the intentions of the framers would have been fairly clear to RTE at the time. How was it, if this was a misunderstanding between RTE and the framers of the legislation, and the framers were in government, how was that misunderstanding allowed to arise?
Well, the misunderstanding appears to have arisen some time after the legislation was carried. The mystery is, what does RTE up to? Because RTE, as we know, they have officially opposed, as is their right to do, Section 31. That's to say, they think it's wrong, it shouldn't be there. And they actually attempted to appeal it to the European Court, but it was found at a lower level in the community that its appeal did not lie. But why, if you object to a given measure as being insufficiently liberal, why do you insist on, why does RTE insist on applying it more stringently than its actual wording requires? Why do they appeal on that from the liberalizing decision of the High Court to the Supreme Court in the hope, apparently, of getting something more stringent?
Well, I think RTE has stated the reasons for that in the hope of obtaining clarity, I think.
Well, they've got the clarity now. I hope they like it.
But I have to take you back again to the question of responsibility for the line that RTE took. Did you not, in the Dáil, say that you had seen the internal guidelines which RTE was issuing, and did you not speak approvingly of those guidelines at the time?
I regarded the guidelines as up to them. If the guidelines were in accordance with the law, okay. I didn't see it my duty to chase from the legislation, which is there, into the guidelines, and I think the media would have blown the whistle on me if I had tried to do that. My job as Minister was to introduce the legislation, get it as clear as I could, and then it was for RTE to apply it. I would say that RTE had a right to interpret the legislation in that way, if that's what they wish to do. But when that interpretation was overthrown by the High Court, it seemed to me that it was senseless on RTE's part to appeal from that decision to the Supreme Court, in the hope, apparently, of getting something more stringent than what the High Court had provided.
Dr. Ryan, can I bring you forward to where this leaves us now? Because it now imposes on RTE broadcasters the need to interpret every single interview with a member of Sinn Féin, to judge the line at which a statement of beliefs reflects underlying political beliefs and therefore constitutes a statement on behalf of Sinn Féin. Well, is that a fair position to put us in?
If RTE are not competent to make decisions like that, the people concerned should be replaced by people who are competent to do it.
Well, let me.
Quite frankly, this is ridiculous. It's very easy to tell when a statement is being used to support a terrorist organization. It doesn't require Einstein to do that. And the mechanism provided by both the High Court and the Supreme Court is eminently sensible. That, okay, if you have a spokesman for a gardening organization, say, who happens also to be a member of Sinn Féin, you are entitled to interview him as speaking for the gardening organization, but you have the sense to record his statement in advance, and if he or she smuggles in spokesmanship for Sinn Féin, then that's in violation of the law.
How will you
and what RTE has to do now is to get on with implementing the law, which has been defined for them. They looked for clarity, they've got it. Let them get on with it.
Well, RTE is going to do that. How will you feel about hearing an interview with Mr. Gerry Adams about his book of short stories published recently?
Well, that would be, if he is, that matter is sub judice. I think I'd better reserve my utterances on that for a court case in which I will be heard.
It's not the time or the place to go back into the general merits or otherwise of Section 31, but could I just put to you once again the criticism that it still leaves RTE able to broadcast a bold statement on behalf of an organisation in which the organisation can represent its message, can judge the nuances very carefully and let the message stand there, and then leaves RTE unable to pick holes in that, to show up any weaknesses which a responsible journalist would see.
If that were what RTE wanted to do, I'm not certain that it always is what RTE wants to do.
I can assure you it always is what RTE wants to do.
Well, if you can speak collectively for everyone in RTE, you must have marvellous insights into the human soul. There are people on RTE, as elsewhere, who do sympathise, honestly sympathise, with Sinn Féin. And I think when those people are on, they're not about to show up Sinn Féin. But I am content with the law as it is. I don't want to extend the law. I don't want to make it any tighter. I don't want to make it any looser. It works well, and I think it is among the reasons why electoral support for Sinn Féin is so very low, and indeed Gerry Adams has said that himself in a tribute to Section 31, an unintended one. We have that keeps Sinn Féin, if you like, in order, and I'm very happy about that. As I say, I don't want to tighten it, I don't want to loosen it. I fear that what RTE has been up to in all this was seeking to discredit the law as it stood in order to make a case for its repeal by making it out to be more stringent than it actually is. And
Dr. Conor Cruise O'Brien,
the Supreme Court have now put paid to that.
Dr. Conor Cruise O'Brien, thank you very much for talking to us on the News at 1. RTE will be making its own response to the Supreme Court judgment later on. The man who took the case to the courts, Larry O'Toole, has given his reaction to this morning's court decision to Marion Richardson.
I'm delighted with the ruling, and it's a great victory for trade unionists, for workers, for people representing their fellow workers, for community activists and people involved in all aspects of Irish life, that now this overextension of the Act has been ruled out of order by the Supreme Court, and they've upholding the High Court judgment. So it's a great victory, a tremendous victory for free speech.
What do you think are the implications of today's ruling?
It means now that our RTE are free to interview people on all matters of all aspects of Irish life, including, as I said, trade unionists, workers, people speaking for their workers, community activists, people speaking on behalf of women's rights, all those aspects now for RTE. Can carry interviews with those people, and those, and by extension, all those people's voices and views can be heard.
Is it really feasible to make a distinction between your activities as a trade unionist and your political views as a member of Sinn Féin?
My activities as a trade union activist and as a community activist and as a defender of people's rights in all aspects, of course, my views should be heard, the same as anyone else's views who wants to talk about trade union activities or community affairs.
But would you accept even carrying out union duties? A Sinn Féin member has his or her political convictions. Don't they come through? Can he or she be a spokesperson for the one without being a spokesperson for the other?
I was chairperson and spokesperson for the Gateaux workers' strike in 1990, and I was broadcast on one occasion, and on numerous occasions I was quoted and had statements carried in the printed media. And I mean, the fact is, I was speaking solely on behalf at that time of the Gateaux workers and as chairperson of the Gateaux strike committee, and the same would also apply in the community where I work and I'm involved in. On numerous occasions I've had to issue statements on behalf of different groups in that community where I live and work in Darndale and Coolock.
What do you think the Minister for Communications, Michael D. Higgins, should do now?
Well, I think the Minister now should take a hard look at censorship in general. That's why this is a victory. This is a victory for free speech. I think now the way must be opened up for an end to censorship.
So you think Section 31 should be repealed?
Of course Section 31 should be repealed. I mean, most people abhor censorship of any description. And I think the Minister and the Government now must take note of this and also take note of the ruling this morning.
Mr. Larry O'Toole, who won his case against RTE in the Supreme Court today. We'll take a break now. The headlines again. Today's Supreme Court judgment against RTE has been welcomed as a great victory for free speech by Larry O'Toole, the Sinn Féin member who brought an action against the station. RTE was appealing against a High Court ruling that the station was wrong to ban interviews with members of Sinn Féin solely because they were members of that party. RTE refused to broadcast interviews with Mr. O'Toole in 1989 when he was the Gateaux Strike Committee chairman. On this programme, Mr. O'Toole said RTE was now free to interview people on all aspects of Irish life.
I'm going to hear with Tuesdays, today at 5. RTE loses its Supreme Court appeal on Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act. Taoiseach is denied access to beef tribunal documents. Fianna Fáil is to be asked to remove the whip from Michael Noonan tomorrow. Also, convicted IRA killer Paul McGee gets a life sentence for the murder of PC Glenn Goodman. 2 Serbs are sentenced to death for war crimes in Bosnia. The Sun is fined £25,000 over the O'Malley letter, and a CBF survey reveals the dietary habits of our teenagers. We have news and sport and of traffic, with first headlines from John Finnerty.
Today's Supreme Court judgment against RTE has been welcomed as a great victory for free speech by Larry O'Toole, the Sinn Féin member who brought the original action against the station. Sinn Féin President Gerry Adams also welcomed the decision and called on the Minister for Communications to scrap Section 31. RTE was appealing against a High Court ruling that the station was wrong to ban interviews with members of Sinn Féin, solely because they were members of that party. RTE refused to broadcast interviews with Mr. O'Toole in 1989, when he was the Gateaux Strike Committee chairman.
Thank you very much indeed, John. Well, after 17 years in operation, the ministerial order under Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act, which bans interviews with spokesmen for named organisations, was finally adjudicated upon by the Supreme Court today, and RTE was found to have been misapplying the legislation when it came to interviews with ordinary members of prescribed organisations, not seeking to advance the cause of those organisations. The issue, of course, arose because of the case of Larry O'Toole, a shop steward at Gateaux during their strike there in 1990. At a press conference today, he outlined the background to the case to our reporter Roisin Boyd.
In 1990,
there was a strike at the Gateaux bakery in Finglas for 4 months, and I was elected as chairperson of the strike committee and a spokesperson for the workers. And after one interview, the RTE discontinued interviews with me. Now the workers were very frustrated first, and then they were very angry that the person they had chosen as their spokesperson was barred from the airwaves, and they felt greatly that the views of the workers in a very, very important strike weren't getting across to the general public.
And they were aware that you were a member of Sinn Féin?
The workers, yeah.
You've been campaigning since that event. Why did you feel it was so important to actually have the right to be interviewed?
Because it distorted the news in that case, in the case of the strike, and that the workers' side wasn't getting the proper coverage and wasn't getting the coverage that the employer, for instance, had full access to the media if he wished to take it up. But the workers' side, because of censorship, wasn't getting across.
And did the workers elect somebody else then to be their spokesperson?
No, the workers didn't. The workers decided that I was to remain as chairperson of the strike committee and as their spokesperson, and I acted as spokesperson to the printed media and in some cases on other radio stations.
Neil Meehan, you're the secretary of the Larry O'Toole Free Speech campaign. You obviously are pleased at today's judgment in the Supreme Court.
Very pleased at today's judgment, and we were confident all along that we would win because the case is so clear. It's obvious that the Section 31 law does not ban people who are members of Sinn Féin speaking on behalf of trade unions, community organisations, women's rights organisations or other organisations, or even as individual members of the public. And as far as we're concerned, RTE has humiliated the good name of Irish broadcasting and journalism in front of the world. That's RTE management, by the way, not necessarily RTE reporters. And I think the question should
Why do you say that?
Because it's RTE management which has imposed a rule on its reporters not to interview people solely on the basis that they are members of Sinn Féin, and it's been explained to RTE at least for 10 years by people active in trade unions and so on, and by people like myself who work who lecture in the media, that they were quite wrong to ban members of Sinn Féin, and the basis on which they did it was wrong, and that has been upheld today by the courts. And I think RTE management should seriously question the strategies that they have adopted. It's completely at variance, say, with the strategy adopted by the BBC in Britain. In the BBC guidelines, it's made quite clear that there is a distinction to be made between a spokesperson for an organisation and somebody acting in a private capacity or speaking on behalf of another organisation. And I think that question should be asked by RTE journalists of its management, and it has been asked by trade unions in Ireland and internationally, who said they were outraged and astonished at RTE's plea for censorship.
And that was Niall Meehan of the Larry O'Toole Free Speech campaign. Before that, you heard Larry O'Toole himself talking to our reporter Roisin Boyd. With me in studio to respond for RTE is Joe Mulholland, the Director of News at RTE. Joe Mulholland, I would put it to you first of all that RTE got it wrong, and got it badly wrong, and has been getting it wrong for the last 17 years.
Well, obviously, Miles, the Supreme Court in its wisdom today found that we were misinterpreting Section 31 and the ministerial orders made under it, interpreting it too narrowly. But let me also say that RTE has over the years written to various ministers on the subject of Section 31, appealing for some liberalisation of the law or some nuances in it. And indeed, I would remind the listeners as well that in 1982, before the general election of that year, that RTE, after taking legal advice, offered party political broadcast to Sinn Féin. Now, subsequently, the minister issued a new order, minister of the time, and this was contested by one of the Sinn Féin candidates, and finally the matter ended up in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found in favour of the minister and found that the state had a right to defend itself, etc., and that Sinn Féin could be considered as a political wing of the IRA, and so on. So therefore, it isn't that we haven't tried to get a more nuanced approach to Section 31, and it's rather disappointing disingenuous now for some people to be saying that this is all the fault of RTE management.
Well, what about the suggestion of Conor Cruise O'Brien that RTE may willfully have got it wrong, doing so in an attempt to discredit Section 31 because RTE was opposed to Section 31?
Well, I would obviously refute that entirely. We, as I have said, nobody raised a voice objecting to our interpretation of Section 31 until very recently, and certainly not throughout the 80s when I myself was involved in current affairs in RTE. And it's a bit late in the day, and perhaps with hindsight, to be coming along and saying that it's all the fault of RTE management.
Well, Sinn Féin have been raising their voice for quite some time now in relation to Section 31, and obviously objecting to the principle of Section 31, but also objecting to the way in which it was applied. And many people have raised their voices against the way in which it is applied, and describing it as ridiculous that people cannot speak on subjects that are completely unrelated to political matters, if they happen to be members of Sinn Féin, UVF, whatever, one of the prescribed organisations.
Yes, but with respect, RTE had to take into account the judgment of the Supreme Court that I've indicated earlier, and we have to remain within the law. And RTE felt, in its wisdom, rightly or wrongly, that the only way it could remain within the law and observe Section 31, which, by the way, is still in place, and the Supreme Court judgment of today not only gives RTE the right, but places the duty on RTE to remain within the law. So we are now faced, and our broadcasters are faced, and our editorial staff in particular are faced with the dilemma of remaining within the law whilst allowing, in some circumstances, in certain contexts, members of Sinn Féin to broadcast on certain matters.
How will RTE management now implement the court's finding? Do you think it's going to be a difficult job? Do you think it's going to be well nigh impossible?
Well, first of all, of course, we will observe the judgment of the court. That goes without saying. And indeed, an interim guidance has been issued by the Director General this afternoon. But that guidance reminds people and our staff that we are still under paragraph 2(1)(a) of the Section 31. We cannot broadcast interviews with spokesmen for Sinn Féin, and we cannot give interviews that are advocating, offering or inviting support for Sinn Féin. So we are now faced with the problem of deciding when a member of Sinn Féin can be interviewed. They can be interviewed, obviously, in some circumstances.
Let me put a hypothetical situation, a hypothetical question to you. Say, for example, a prominent member of Sinn Féin, the UDA, the UVF, one of the organisations mentioned in Section 31, writes a best-selling thriller related to the Troubles. Could he or she be interviewed on RTE in relation to that particular novel? Because it is part of the judgment refers to the constitutional right to earn. That's on page 16 of the judgment.
That now has to be a matter of editorial judgment. A member of the UFF or the IRA or some such organisation writing a novel on the Troubles would have to be obviously perused very closely, and a judgment taken on whether that novel or work of fiction was purely a creative work or was a work of propaganda. And by the way, we are still bound by Section 18 as well of the Broadcasting Act, which precludes us from broadcasting any matter which would tend to incite to violence or undermine the authority of the state. So there are many considerations.
And do you think that RTE is going to face difficulty in the forthcoming months and forthcoming years, and a premium is going to be placed on editorial decisions?
Well, obviously editorial decisions have to be made every day of the week, perhaps not in as delicate situations as this.
Well, the situation was unambiguous up to now. Now there is an ambiguity there.
There is a substantial amount of ambiguity, and it is the work now of the organisation and of the editorial staff, while Section 31 is still in place, and it is still in place, of interpreting it in a different way but of living within the law and respecting the spirit of Section 31 to the letter and of Section 18 of the Broadcasting Act.
Joe Mulholland, Director of News with RTE, thank you very much indeed for joining us. In our Dáil studio is Francis Fitzgerald, TD Fine Gael's spokesperson on communications. Francis Fitzgerald, the reaction, first of all, of the Fine Gael party to the findings of the Supreme Court today.
Well, I can indeed see why Joe Mulholland has said what he has said about the difficulties that editorial staff and broadcasting staff are going to be faced with now. The Fine Gael position is that we unambiguously support the thinking behind Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act, but of course it's for the courts to decide the interpretation, and we've seen that today. I think what we want to see, and indeed I would say the people who were in Trinity College the other night and out marching on Sunday want to see, is they certainly do not want to see terrorists propagating violence on the airwaves, and that's the spirit behind Section 31, and we have to ensure, I believe, that that spirit is kept to. Now, I think there's going to be certain
Section
difficulties.
18 of the Broadcasting Act not provide for that, and is there not now a case for the entire and complete removal of Section 31 because of the ambiguity to which Joe Mulholland has referred?
Well, I agree. We do see now that the RTE practice of a blanket ban has been deemed to be unlawful today. But of course, I think what we would say is there may well be a need now for supplementary ministerial orders to see that the propaganda is not.
But RTE has sought the interpretation of ministers in the past, as Joe Mulholland has
They have
said,
indeed,
and perhaps has got contradictory interpretations.
Well, I think I have to say, I think this puts it up to the minister, and as I say, I do think that perhaps supplementary ministerial orders will be needed, because there's no doubt there are going to be grey areas. We've seen this before on questions and answers and other programmes, and there are going to be difficult situations where it's going to be hard to quite work out whether in fact the person being interviewed is really talking about something different, or whether in fact what is actually happening in effect is a further peddling of the philosophy of violence.
Is there not a danger, though, that we're going to see RTE running to the Minister or the Department of Communications every time an editorial decision has to be taken on any matter arising out of this Supreme Court judgment?
Well, I think that's probably putting it somewhat extremely, but I certainly think that you will need further clarification. And again, I'd go back to what Joe Mulholland has said. It's quite clear there are going to be difficult editorial decisions probably being faced on a fairly regular basis as a result of this. And so I'll be very interested to hear what the Minister has to say, and I do think further supplementary ministerial orders may be necessary.
So you don't think, in summary, that Section 31 at this stage has been, in any sense, brought into disrepute by the Supreme Court judgment and should now be abandoned altogether?
Well, I don't think brought into disrepute is the way I would put it. I mean, obviously further clarification is needed. But what I would say is that we should be true to the original thinking and spirit behind Section 31. And I would say that's what the vast majority of people in this country want to see. They don't want to see violence being peddled on our televisions.
Francis Fitzgerald, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Francis Fitzgerald, TD, the Fine Gael spokesperson on communications, talking from our Dáil studio. It's 17 minutes past 5. We'll take a break.
Good evening, the news at 6:30 with John Finnerty. The Supreme Court says RTE's ban on interviews with members of Sinn Féin was wrong. The Taoiseach tells the Dáil there will be no avoidable delay in closing off loopholes in the extradition laws. IRA man Paul McGee is jailed for life for the murder of a special policeman. The Taoiseach is refused access to certain documents at the Beef Tribunal. 2 Bosnian Serb soldiers are sentenced to death for the rape and murder of Muslim women. RTE has lost its Supreme Court appeal on Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act. RTE was appealing against a High Court ruling that the station was wrong to ban interviews with members of Sinn Féin, solely because they were members of the party. Our legal affairs correspondent, Kieran Wood.
During the Gateaux bakery strike in 1990, RTE interviewed the chairman of the strike committee, Larry O'Toole. But when the station discovered that Mr O'Toole was a member of Sinn Féin, they refused to broadcast any further interviews with him. RTE claimed that according to the ministerial order made under Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act, it couldn't broadcast any interviews with members of Sinn Féin. The order directs RTE to refrain from transmitting any broadcast with a person representing the organisation styling itself Sinn Féin. RTE said that because of the number of people working in the station and the varying interpretations of Section 31, the only way to prevent a breach of the ministerial order was to ban all interviews with Sinn Féin members on any subject. Mr O'Toole appealed that decision to the High Court, and last August Mr Justice O'Hanlon ruled that RTE was wrong. Immediately after his judgment, RTE issued a directive to staff, telling them to stick to existing guidelines pending a Supreme Court appeal. Mr O'Toole went back to the High Court, and in December Mr Justice O'Hanlon ordered RTE to issue new guidelines to staff in accordance with the earlier ruling. RTE appealed to the Supreme Court. In court today, the Chief Justice, Mr Justice Finlay, said RTE was entitled to take reasonable and practical steps to comply with the ministerial order. That could involve barring members of Sinn Féin from taking part in live broadcasts. But he said RTE could supervise and monitor recorded interviews with members of Sinn Féin to ensure they didn't contravene Section 31. He said RTE had misinterpreted the Act and he dismissed the appeal. Mr John Traynor, counsel for RTE, said the station would now instruct staff to apply Section 31 in accordance with the court ruling, and it wasn't necessary for the court to order the station to issue a new directive to staff.
Larry O'Toole, the Sinn Féin member who challenged RTE's interpretation of Section 31, welcomed the Supreme Court decision. He described the ruling as a victory for free speech. Mark Lane reports.
Mr O'Toole said the decision in his favour was a victory for trade unionists, women's rights activists, community groups and political campaigners. He said RTE had been willing to act as an agent of the state and had gone far beyond what the Section 31 provision allowed. In his own case, he had been prevented from airing the views of union members during an industrial dispute.
For instance, going back to the Gateaux strike in 1990, when a person, myself, who was elected as chair and spokesperson of that strike committee, wasn't allowed to put the views of 400 workers across on the airwaves.
Mr O'Toole said journalists had lost their jobs for opposing censorship laws and heads should roll among RTE management. He said the station should present the news as it is, and he called for the complete removal of Section 31.
It's a good day for freedom of speech in this country, but I might add that I think now all campaigners for freedom of speech should put pressure on the Minister, Michael D. Higgins, who is on record as opposing censorship and on record also as opposing Section 31 censorship, and on the government to repeal Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act.
Fine Gael has said there may be a need for supplementary ministerial orders to clarify what it calls a very grey area in Section 31. Sinn Féin President Gerry Adams welcomed the decision and called on the Communications Minister to scrap Section 31 altogether. And RTE has issued interim guidelines in accordance with today's ruling to all staff. Michael O'Kane reports.
At RTE, the Director of News, Joe Mulholland, said the Supreme Court decision will cause difficulties for staff.
This throws a bit of light on Section 31 for us, but it still creates some difficulties for us because, as far as we know, and we're still obviously studying the Supreme Court judgment of today, but as far as we can see, members of Sinn Féin can now be interviewed.
At Leinster House, Fine Gael spokesperson in Arts, Culture and the Gaeltacht Francis Fitzgerald said the Minister Michael D. Higgins will have to examine the implications of the ruling.
In Fine Gael we support Section 31, and I think as evidence from the thousands of people who've taken to the streets recently, many people in this country do not want to see terrorism being peddled on the airwaves, do not want to hear it being propagated on the airwaves.
And how would you feel, for example, if a Sinn Féin councillor was interviewed about local constituency issues?
Well, what we've seen from the judgment today is that the blanket ban is unlawful. And it seems to me now that there is still a grey area, and it may be that in that situation you described, that further ministerial orders may be necessary.
Progressive Democrat leader Des O'Malley said he believes today's Supreme Court decision was not what the Dáil originally intended when Section 31 was passed.
Well, I think it will create something of a difficulty for RTE. Because obviously they'll be a bit uncertain about the position in future. But it does appear that they're now allowed to interview members of Sinn Féin, provided it's not on political matters and provided they record it in advance. It's not, I think, quite what the Dáil intended when the section was passed. But we have to accept that interpretation now.
Lost its Supreme Court appeal yesterday against a High Court decision last year that its blanket ban on broadcasting interviews with members of Sinn Féin was wrong. The practice on RTE in the past has been for members of Sinn Féin not to be interviewed on any subject, irrespective of its political content. RTE is now to prepare new guidelines for journalists on foot of the decision because the Chief Justice said yesterday that RTE's interpretation of the ban under Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act was an addition or an amendment to the order rather than a method of implementation of the order. There will undoubtedly be political discussion on this subject, and the man responsible for the area, indeed for the order, is the Minister for Arts, Culture and the Gaeltacht, Michael D. Higgins. He's also in the news today on foot of another decision, this time his own, to reactivate the film board in the wake of Neil Jordan's Oscar success. And the Minister joins me now from the Dáil studio. Minister, good morning. Minister, good morning.
Good morning, Minister. I'm sure the Minister is there because I know we did make contact with the Minister before the programme, so I'm just wondering if I persist for a moment or two, will the Minister come through? Minister?
Yes, Pat.
Excellent. I'm glad we didn't go to commercials or something like that.
Good morning, John. I'm glad I'm not responsible for the communications in it.
All right. But let's talk about Section 31. First of all, were you surprised at the outcome in the Supreme Court?
Well, I knew that there was going to be a very complex issue to be resolved, because, quite frankly, the guidelines issued within the station itself, within television and radio by RTE, are a matter of practice. And that was always a matter which was really requiring adjudication if it was contested. So effectively I would probably be expecting the RTE authority to respond in the short term to the new judgment now. My concern, as you know, and it has been stated publicly, is as to the usefulness of Section 31 in achieving its purposes as a section within a piece of broadcasting legislation. And as you know as well, that before I took on responsibilities for broadcasting, that the order had been renewed, and I have committed myself to reviewing the operation of Section 31, but reviewing in terms of its adequacy as a legislative instrument.
Yeah. You have been against, if you like, the thrust of censorship that is inherent in Section 31 in the past, isn't that so?
Yes, I have stated it as well, because I don't believe in being evasive at all about these issues, that I am unhappy about any restrictions that are placed in the way of people who want to practice professionally their journalism or any other form of activity, that there is a certain amount of professional integrity involved, which I respect. I think that if I recall the interviews that have been given both before the judgment and afterwards by people within RTE, is that they have suggested that there was a variability in interpretation, but really that is a matter for professional practice within the organisation that is RTE.
Well, all of us have had
the question that you do ask me is, yes, I have been very bothered always about any interference with that. For example, I have said that my own view has been that I would confront people about their actions and the consequences of their action. I am not, you see, when I am reviewing it, may I introduce you to the complexity of it? For example, I've heard interviews, again, by those who say, well, you can interview them about this, about gardening, or you can interview them about roses, but you can't interview them about their substantial political activities. I'm not entirely convinced that this liberal way, if you like, is any advantage at all, but it's something that, again, in the course of the review, that I will look at.
Well, the key to the case, in a sense, was the fact that you had a trade unionist representing people who felt that he was deprived of putting his side, therefore his workers' side of the case, on the national airwaves, when the other side could be discussed quite openly, and that's, I presume, where the case fell for RTE and succeeded for Mr. O'Toole. However, the difficulty that would now be faced is when do matters become political? Because it could be argued that a trade union matter could enter into the realm of mainstream party politics, and in fact frequently does.
Well, do you see, is this the way to go? I think that you're making a very strong case for the actions that I have chosen to take. I have said that the order had been renewed when I became minister, and I've said that between the period, that time, and the period when it comes up for renewal, I intend to avail of the opportunity of looking at all of these issues in their complexity. I'm not so sure that there is a clear case for the viability of that particular method of operation. That is, having people decide, well, this barely falls into the political, this is on the edges, this falls out of the political. Is this the best form of resolution? I'm not convinced of that, and as I have said, I haven't taken a decision on it. I intend, obviously, now to read the judgment. I will obviously be very interested in the response of the RTE authority to the part of it that is purely their affair. Remember, they are the authority, and it's their interpretations that have been contested in court. What I have to bear in mind is this, is that what should happen when it comes up for renewal. Now, what I have said was that instead of just simply automatically renewing it as if no issues had been thrown up, I intend to avail of the period that I have to look at it. And I think that is a very forthright and straightforward way of doing it. And I think that people must remember that it was renewed again and again without the review I'm speaking of. And I really need the space to look at this very complex issue with the thoroughness it deserves.
Okay, I would suggest to you there may not be any appetite in the Dáil generally to change the thrust of the order, which was to keep people from Sinn Féin who might defend the right of the men of violence to do what they do, to keep them off the airwaves. There might be certainly no appetite to change that situation.
Well, it isn't a matter just of the appetite of the Dáil. It's a matter of what is good legislation and what is good broadcasting practice. May I make an opinion, may I make a suggestion to you? Those, for example, who argue that it is possible, let us say, to reconstruct a kind of a liberal approach towards this, suggest that, well, we will be able to draw a list of things rather easily upon which we can interview people. And then let us imagine that after some terrible events like we've had recently, somebody who had defended violence is on, and you proceed to interview them on something off the liberal list, and you are precluded from putting a straightforward question to them. On what basis do you possibly condone murder and violence? Is that good broadcasting? You see, it can't be made simple, and while people may want to dodge issues and others, it has to be reviewed, as I have said, with respect for its full complexity.
Well, the Anglo-Irish dimension, Minister, because the British in relatively recent times introduced their own restrictions on broadcasting by members of these organisations, and it may be seen in the context of fairly delicate Anglo-Irish manoeuvring.
Absolutely.
It would be inappropriate for us to, in a sense, move back to a more liberal broadcasting arena at a time when they've toughened up.
Well, here's the very interesting thing, is that, of course, you're now, I think, which is, I'm very glad, seeing the point of the questions I answered, I think within 2 weeks of being made Minister for Broadcasting, when I said that my review would be carried out and any changes or any suggestions I was making would be in consultation with my colleagues in Cabinet, and particularly with the Ministers for Justice and Foreign Affairs. And I made that point at the time. People were very impatient for a very quick action, but I quite realised the point that you are making. Obviously, there are two separate things involved. There are three, really. One is the Broadcasting Act being used adequately? Does it lead to good broadcasting practices? And if one wants to make changes, how does one judge the impact of one's actions, taking the sensitivities of Anglo-Irish relations, events in Northern Ireland, and when is the timing right? These are the three main dimensions I have to bear in mind as I do a quite thorough review, and that review I'm going to do. I'm not going to be dislodged by those who don't want to review, nor by those who want me to do it yesterday.
Began at the Dublin rally last Sunday when people from the Relatives for Justice group were involved in scuffles after people objected to their banners highlighting deaths by British soldiers in the north, and when they were also excluded from speaking at the rally. Now, we've had a lot of reaction as well to yesterday's contribution by Kieran McKeown, one of the founders of the North's Peace People movement established in 1976 after the deaths of the Maguire children. And he gave his insights in the light of his experience into the difficulties and the possible pitfalls facing the Peace 93 movement here. And the first pitfall, of course, is the fallout from last Sunday's rally. Now, we're going to hear in a moment from the Relatives for Justice group and also from the Peace 93 group here, because in Belfast we've Anne Bradley. Hello, Anne.
Hello.
And you were at the Dublin rally on Sunday?
That's right.
Okay, and in Dublin, Francis Banks, one of the founders of the Peace 93 movement, who helped organise the Dublin rally. Francis, you're very welcome as well.
Thank you.
Now, Anne, to tell us first of all about your particular bereavement. What happened to your husband?
Well, my husband was killed by the security forces.
Yeah.
But I wasn't there to emphasise that. I went there on behalf of the children who had been murdered in the north, at the request of their mothers, asking Relatives for Justice would we please come along and represent their children, as half a dozen or so of the mothers wanted to go along and hold photographs of their children, just as a respect to honour our dead. I did not have a photograph of my husband, and on no occasion did I mention him. I just went along as moral support for the mothers.
For the mothers. Now, do you believe that there is a kind of a disproportionate sympathy for the parents of the children in Warrington compared to the sympathy that's often expressed for people in the north?
Well, the only way I think people can judge that is we have had 121 children killed here in the north of Ireland, and unfortunately, which I regret very much, 2 children were murdered there in England, and the response that the Dublin people give for it, it was just unbelievable. Now I'm saying, obviously, if I had personally have lost a child, I would definitely have felt that my child was being, forgotten about, because why did these people not come out and condemn all the children that were killed in the north when they were being killed, dating back to 1969? I mean, where were all these people then? If these people maybe had come out even 2, 3, 4 years ago, how many children's lives would have been saved then? Why are these people only coming out now when it happened in England?
What happened to you on Sunday? I mean, what sort of unfortunate experience did you have, Anne?
Well, first of all, before we went down, when the mothers got in touch with me and asked me would I phone the organisers and ask could we go, I phoned and we were told, well, they would rather we didn't because it might look political, right? Mm-hmm. And I told that back to the mothers, and the mother says, well, they still wish to go and respect their dead, and they asked my opinion, and I says, of course we should go and respect their dead, because I'm intending to go anyway and stand and respect my dead. And I drove the mothers down, and when we arrived there, it was a shock. It was horror the way we were greeted by those people that had white ribbons in their breasts representing peace, actually verbally and attacked us. I mean, I can't believe it, the hatred that was in those people's eyes for us. I mean, it was unbelievable.
Well, I have to ask you this. I mean, did people maybe get the impression, because you were highlighting the deaths by British Army people, that you in some way were representative of Sinn Féin or the IRA?
Well, I think, personally, if you go for peace, it doesn't matter who killed who. You know what I mean? You represent everyone. You have to represent people that's been killed by the UVF, the ARA, the British soldiers, the army. You have to condemn it all.
And so do you have members
one people what they were doing?
And do you have, in Relatives for Justice, do you have members whose loved ones have been killed by the IRA, for instance?
Unfortunately, no. In an ideal world, we would love to have those people on our group. But we, as you know, we are not like Dublin. I mean, we don't mix our communities down here.
Isn't that the nub of your problem, that you were only prepared to highlight deaths on one side and not the other? And this particular march was instigated by deaths which had caused by the IRA, and it may have seen, now I don't want to put words in anybody's mouths, but it may have seen that you were apologists in some way for the IRA because you weren't condemning their killings. I don't know whether we've lost Anne there. Francis Banks, how do you feel about what happened on Sunday to Anne Bradley?
Well, first thing I'd like to say is that we apologise to Anne and to anyone who came down and who felt hurt or humiliated in any way. That wasn't our intention. And we would absolutely support her when she says that all victims of violence, regardless of what side of the community it comes from, to us it is all the same. The fact that the rally was organised out of the Warrington bombings, I mean, I stood up at the very beginning and said this is for all the victims. It wasn't, it was, the Warrington bombings was the catalyst, but in fact it was to represent all the victims, and indeed Anne was welcomed by, I mean, we were welcoming her, and I think it was just maybe the heat of the moment. But
why do you think people turned on Anne and her people? Was it some confusion?
Maybe they misunderstood, I think it was just, as I say, the heat of the moment. It was a very emotional, there was a lot of emotion, a lot of feeling, there was an awful lot of people there, and in fairness, I mean, when you think that there were 20,000 people there, that there were very, very few incidents. Now, I know the people who were hurt were deeply hurt, and Susan is very sorry for that. And if I may just over the air say to Anne and to anyone who was hurt in this way that, after the programme maybe we could exchange numbers, and Susan would like to talk to them privately and apologise.
All right, and going back to Anne, because I hear Anne is back there now, and this whole business, Francis and Susan would like to apologise to you for the personal hurt that you suffered, but I was just in the process of asking you when we were cut off in some way about whether or not that people might have been confused and thought you were some front for Sinn Féin or the IRA, and they didn't want politicians or any of their affiliated organisations present at the peace meeting?
No, I definitely do not believe that, because my belief is that peace rally was organised by, it's politically backed as far as I'm concerned. Because
why do you say that?
Because the mothers that I was there with would have been welcomed onto that stand, even should they only have stood up and said a prayer for their dead. But their mothers were refused to do that. Now, as far as I'm concerned, if it was solely peace, and then people could put their hands in their hearts and say, we are no way politically involved here, then all murder should have been condemned. All their mothers wanted to do was stand up there. Two women. What harm could they have done against...
Going back to, I think, the weakness that people might see in your case is the fact that in your organisation you have no relatives of those killed by the IRA. Now, the IRA have killed their own people by accident. They have killed people, they said, subsequently by mistake, Catholics, where they were looking for people of another religion or another situation. They've killed people they've labelled as informers and so on. Why do you not welcome into your movement, at a time when we know that there are women meeting across the Falls-Shankill divide in women's associations and women's clubs, why would you not have people who are bereaved by the IRA in your group?
In our group, we have welcomed everyone. I have been in touch with CAJ to ask them would they contact some Protestant families. This is not the first time I have done this, but people have to realise that in Belfast it's not as easy as it would be in the like of the South. Catholics and Protestants will not come together as easy. And I put it like this: the politicians can't even sit down and talk together. They can't even decide whether they'll meet to have a talk. So how do they expect the ordinary people who have lost their victims to come together? Everyone is frightened of everyone else, and that is the truth of the matter. But our group welcomes everybody. And let me say once again that we are in no way politically involved, politically backed, and that is a fact. Take that from me.
All right.
We are not politically backed.
Okay, and now Susan,
what that march was on Sunday, and the fact that we were attacked and our children's photographs were spat on, actually spat on a photograph of a 10-year-old child that was murdered, come up and spat on it. This was middle class people who done this, not working class, middle class people. And let me say, well, them people should hold their head in shame today for what they done.
We have, as I said, Francis Banks here, and you maintain that this movement was political. Now, Francis, what do you say to that charge from Anne Bradley?
Well, I'd like to put my hand on my heart now and say that this movement came out genuinely and sincerely out of Susan McHugh's concern and outrage at what had happened, and it built from that really to say that everyone who has suffered, everyone who is a victim and grieves. It doesn't matter what side of the community they come from. And I would absolutely take Anne's point that we have been very remiss down here over the children, indeed all the victims of North of Ireland over the last 23 years. Yes, we should have, Anne, stood up a lot sooner. We should have done it, but we didn't, and we apologise to you, and I apologise to you on behalf of Peace 93 for not doing it. But please understand that we're doing it now, and we really are sincere and genuine, and there is no political motivation at all.
And you're saying, as far as the organisers were concerned, whatever happened in the middle of the crowd, it was not of your doing?
Absolutely not. And in fact, just to explain it a little bit, I mean, Susan and myself and Michael and Arthur, we are actually very ordinary people. And from Wednesday night, when we had the meeting in Trinity, we had to galvanise ourselves into action to organise a rally, which none of us had ever done before, and none of us had a clue how to go about. And it was really, I mean, there wasn't one moment lost. And the people who, I mean, if you saw the truck that we were standing on, it was just full of people. And even the people who were on the platform, some of them couldn't speak, never mind the people who were down.
So there's absolutely no political background to this, good, bad or indifferent.
And what I'd like to say to you, Anne, is that we would like to invite you to stand on the platform at some stage. I don't know when, because everything is so fast at the moment. But I know that Susan is going to Belfast this weekend, and perhaps if you would forgive us or understand us and accept us into your heart this weekend, and maybe we could meet even privately and express our sincere apologies to you.
We are having our own protest here for all our dead on Sunday, right, being organised by Relatives for Justice. And what I am saying is, if the people in the South really, really want to show us and make up for what they've done, then come and stand beside us on Sunday. Come down and stand beside the people of the North. Don't separate yourselves from us. Join us. Stand up and say, look, we've had enough, and we're not letting these people be
And do
murdered
you have
anymore.
rules about banners and things like that, so there won't be any political organisations there?
There is no political speakers whatsoever. This time it's going to come. This talking will be done by the mothers who have lost the children, and any mother from any part of Northern Ireland or the South or anywhere else that's lost a child can get in touch with me, and if we have time, the more the merrier that speaks, and no one will be discredited, or no one will be refused to put their point across to me.
Right, Anne, thank you very much for that. We leave Anne Bradley in Belfast. I want to say a few more words to Francis Banks, so I'll do that after this break. Now, Francis, what do you want people to do if they want to get involved in some way in your peace movement?
Well, I mean, this movement will not survive unless people do get involved. So, I mean, if you genuinely are sorry about what's happened over the last 20 years and you want to do something, there are very practical things you can do. One is you can send a postcard to Box 1993, which is very easy to remember.
P.O. Box 1993.
P.O. Box 1993, just saying we want peace now, some positive message. Do that right away, please. And we're going to collect them all after Easter, and we will do something with them. The other practical things we need paper clips, we need fax machines. We have got office space, we got that yesterday given to us, but we need every single other thing. We are totally unfunded, we are not having any funds at all. So if people want to have skills, or if they're graphic designers who could do leaflets, anything like that, that's what we want people to do.
Okay, if people want to get in touch with you, I mean, you're still fairly scattered, so
we are a bit scattered, yeah. But I have a mobile number which will be operational probably from tomorrow. It will be operational from tomorrow, and that's 088 555 940. Can I just say one thing about Sunday? I mean, Sunday, we are not organising Sunday. Sunday, again, is over to the people on the ground. And some people have been ringing in with suggestions. And I just give an illustration just so that people can maybe tag on to them. One person suggested that we stop the traffic at 1 o'clock when the Hyde Park rally is on, just for a minute. The other thing was, to tie ribbons on your gate posts, to get choirs outside your local church to sing the anthem that we launched, or any other peace song, to have an ecumenical service, to do, somebody from Portumna rang me last night to say they're doing a walk in the square and they're going to sing at the end, just sing some peace. It doesn't have to take all day.
Okay, so this is kind of a spontaneous thing. People can do their own thing.
Can do their own things, but we would love them to get in touch with us and tell us what they're doing, so that we can know, and then we can contact them and use the feedback from them. This is very much not an organisation, a group that want it to be from the ground up, not us. And all of the suggestions and all of the plans that we have here were suggestions that came to us from the floor in Trinity College.
Right. And
we don't have the
Jerry Adams intervention, what was your reaction to that?
Well, if Sinn Féin want to get involved in the peace rally, and if that means that they just sincerely mean they want to do something for peace, well, that's fine. We would say,
But you don't want political parties involved, you don't want placards, you don't want any of those things, do you?
Well, we would like it to be dignified and moderate, and, not anything like a big... it isn't a protest, it's a day of peace. It's meant to be, if you like, gentle and quiet.
So your hearts are open?
Our hearts are very open, and we really want to do something to move things forward.
Francis Banks, thank you very much for joining us. Just after 12 as we pause for the ambulance. This is RTE Radio One. You're listening to The Pat Kenny Show. Time for the midday news with Anne Doyle.
Good afternoon. The Fine Gael leader John Bruton has said there's concern that the Supreme Court's decision on Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act may result in RTE asking Sinn Féin representatives soft questions instead of hard ones about their murderous activities. In the Dáil this morning, he asked when the new broadcasting legislation would be introduced and if it would deal with the ministerial review of Section 31. The Taoiseach said the legislation mightn't be ready for the current session of the Dáil. If not, it would be taken early in the next session. The peace group New Consensus is to make an appeal to the IRA to declare a unilateral ceasefire. The appeal will be made in Dublin tomorrow evening during a vigil outside the headquarters of Sinn Féin. A spokesman for New Consensus, Michael Nugent, said a ceasefire would allow the public to take seriously the claim by Mr Jerry Adams that Sinn Féin wished to become involved in peace activities. The Limerick West TD, Michael J. Noonan, is expected to have the Fianna Fáil whip removed from him by the Parliamentary Party, which has begun meeting in Leinster House. Mr Noonan has been strongly critical critical of the Taoiseach's stance on Articles 2 and 3 of the Constitution. Our political staff say the motion concerning Mr Noonan is unlikely to be passed unanimously.
Now, some of the comments which have come through on the subject we've just been discussing. Betty Marr, I would like to sympathise with Anne Bradley for the treatment meted out to her in O'Connell Street last Sunday. I'm sure there are thousands who feel as I feel. Jack O'Byrne, the peace people should organise a mass under the cross in the Phoenix Park instead of a demonstration and have bishops from all denominations there, especially around Easter. This would be great. A female caller was at the peace rally on Sunday and felt that while the people on the platform were speaking, there was this chant of peace, peace, peace and out, out, out going on. Susan McHugh is trying to make a fresh start and everyone was there to do their best, but there was this undercurrent, people trying to disrupt the meeting. PJ Carraher in Armagh, PJ was at the rally on Sunday and his daughter-in-law had a picture of his son who was shot by the British Army on the 30th of December 1990. With her and the picture and themselves, they were spat upon and told that they got what they deserved. And he says, we would have expected this type of thing to happen on the Shankill Road in Belfast, but not at a peace rally in Dublin. His son was 20 years of age and had a baby 1 year old. Pauline Curran in Rathfarnham, I was at the rally on Sunday about 5 rows from the front and about 2 feet away from the people with the banners whom we shunned. The reason we didn't want them there was that they were political banners saying British soldiers shot, etc., etc., and the others were similar. I didn't realise that the people carrying them were families of those killed, but it wasn't the day for that kind of partisanship. We felt that if these banners were shown on TV screens, it would seem that it was an anti-British rally, when in fact it was an anti-violence rally. Peter Bean, I was at the rally on Sunday near the GPO. A group of people from Northern Ireland had a book of condolences for people to sign for the 6 Catholics who were shot last week in the north. They were holding up banners with the names of the 6 who'd been shot. That's all they were doing. They weren't shouting or demonstrating. 4 members of the Gardaí came along and just ripped the banners out of their hands. Sean O'Marhala in Dublin, I was at the rally on Sunday. The only political banners I saw were those asking for the end of Articles 2 and 3. The parents of the children killed in the north just had pictures of their children with them. They were given a hostile reception by a small element. Brian Stanley, I attended the Peace March on Sunday and was disgusted by the behaviour of some of the crowd towards Margaret Carraher, whose husband was killed by the British Army. I think the peace movement will have to take up the British Army violence and not be selective, otherwise it won't be successful. Frank Owens, as far as this new peace initiative is concerned, I think the less politicians have to do with it, the better. As Mr Adams is a politician, I think that those who seek peace should appeal to him to stay out of this. With regard to the resolution of the northern situation, politicians, be they in Leinster House, in the 6 counties or in Westminster, would seem to have very little to offer. It is hardly surprising, considering the mess that has been made of the economies of both countries by the same politicians. Joseph Campbell, the first thing that needs to be established is justice in the north towards the minority. The people in the south can't understand how the minority in the north are treated. They are regularly harassed by the British Army. Joyce O'Flynn, if Gerry Adams or any of that crowd are involved in future peace rallies, I won't go. Anyone who has blood on their hands should not be there. Eric in Clonee in County Meath, the Irish community in Britain is staging a peace rally in Hyde Park next Sunday. Perhaps Gerry Adams would like to attend that. Maybe he'd be more welcome there. Margaret Burke in Dublin 12, I was at the Peace March on Sunday. Some of the banners from the northern groups were misleading. The crowd took it that they were IRA people because some of them mentioned the British Army. I was quite close, but I would never have spat on anyone. No one should have been spat upon. That's not really what the rally was all about. So they're just some of the calls talking about what happened on Sunday and the ongoing fortunes of the peace movement.